A nation at the crossroads. The disputed election of July 28, 2024. Venezuela, grappling with economic turmoil and political polarization, faced a critical juncture with the presidential election. Incumbent Nicolas Maduro sought re-election amidst widespread discontent and allegations of authoritarianism. The opposition, led by Edmundo González Urrutia, aimed to unseat Maduro and bring democratic reform. The election was marred by irregularities, casting doubt on the legitimacy of the results. The electoral process was plagued by controversy from the outset. The forced resignation of the previous National Electoral Council Board raised concerns about impartiality. Disqualification of key opposition figures fueled suspicions of manipulation. Despite obstacles, the opposition urged citizens to vote and demanded transparency. Election day arrived with palpable tension. Reports of voter intimidation and manipulation surfaced. International observers noted irregularities and expressed concerns. As results confirmed a narrow victory for Maduro, the opposition alleged widespread fraud. The disputed election plunged Venezuela into a deep political crisis. The international community watched, aware of the nation's precarious stability. The world awaited Maduro's next move and the response of the Venezuelan people. Maduro's iron fist repression and the arrest of González Urrutia. In the aftermath of the disputed election, Nicolas Maduro responded to the growing dissent and international condemnation with characteristic defiance and a tightening grip on power. His government, dismissing the allegations of fraud as a ploy by the opposition and foreign powers to destabilize the nation, moved swiftly to silence dissent and consolidate control. The arrest warrant issued for opposition leader Edmundo González Urrutia on trumped-up charges of treason and inciting violence sent shockwaves through Venezuela and the international community. González Urrutia, who had sought refuge in the Chilean embassy in Caracas, denounced the charges as politically motivated, a blatant attempt to silence the opposition and crush any challenge to Maduro's authority. His arrest warrant, widely seen as an act of intimidation and reprisal for daring to challenge the regime, drew widespread condemnation from human rights organizations and democratic governments worldwide. The Venezuelan people, already grappling with economic hardship and political uncertainty, were now confronted with a government seemingly intent on suppressing any form of dissent. The Maduro regime's crackdown extended beyond the targeting of prominent opposition figures. Security forces were deployed to quell protests using tear gas, rubber bullets, and arbitrary arrests to disperse demonstrators. Independent media outlets faced censorship and intimidation, their offices raided, and journalists harassed for reporting on the government's actions. The space for democratic dissent, already shrinking under Maduro's rule, contracted further, raising fears of a return to outright authoritarianism. A chorus of condemnation, the international response to Venezuela's crisis. The international community responded to the disputed Venezuelan election and the subsequent crackdown on dissent with a resounding chorus of condemnation. Democratic governments refused to recognize Maduro's re-election, citing lack of transparency and attempts to silence the opposition. The UN, EU, and OAS called for an end to violence, release of political prisoners, and a return to democratic order. The US imposed sanctions on individuals and entities undermining democracy and human rights in Venezuela. The EU followed with travel bans and asset freezes on high-ranking Venezuelan officials. Despite international pressure, Maduro remained defiant, accusing foreign powers of meddling. He sought alliances with Russia, China, and Cuba to counter growing international isolation. The people's will, protests, demands, and the price of dissent. Despite the climate of fear and repression, the Venezuelan people refused to be silenced. In cities and towns across the country, they took to the streets, risking their freedom and safety to demand their voices be heard. From the slums of Caracas to the oil-rich regions of Zulia, a new wave of protests erupted, fueled by anger over the stolen election, the deteriorating economic conditions, and the government's brutal response to dissent. These protests, largely decentralized and organized through social media, brought together a diverse cross-section of Venezuelan society: students, teachers, doctors, nurses, oil workers, and informal vendors, all united in their yearning for change. Their demands were simple, yet profound: free and fair elections, respect for human rights, an end to corruption, and a government that prioritized the needs of its people over the consolidation of its own power. However, the Maduro regime met these expressions of popular will with brute force. Security forces, using tear gas, water cannons, and live ammunition, cracked down on protesters, leaving scores injured and many dead. Arbitrary arrests became commonplace, with thousands detained without due process, often subjected to torture and inhumane treatment in overcrowded prisons. The regime's message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. A beacon of hope, the Venezuelan struggle for democracy and international solidarity. The situation in Venezuela stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of democracy and the constant struggle to uphold human rights in the face of authoritarianism. The Venezuelan people, despite enduring years of hardship, economic devastation, and political repression, continue to inspire the world with their courage, resilience, and unwavering commitment to democratic ideals. Their struggle is a testament to the indomitable human spirit, the yearning for freedom that transcends borders and ideologies. The international community has a moral imperative to stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people. Diplomatic pressure, while important, is not enough. Concrete actions are needed to hold the Maduro regime accountable for its actions, to support civil society organizations and human rights defenders working tirelessly under extremely challenging conditions, and to provide humanitarian assistance to those most affected by the crisis. The fight for democracy in Venezuela is not just a Venezuelan fight. It is a global struggle against authoritarianism, a struggle for the very soul of humanity. The international community must not waver in its support for the Venezuelan people's aspirations for a better future, a future where democracy prevails, human rights are respected, and the voices of the people are heard. Their struggle is a beacon of hope, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit, the yearning for freedom, cannot be extinguished.